Hello, and welcome to another WORT candidate debate. This time we are in District 13 on Madison's Common Council. My name is Jade Siri Ramos. I am a producer and reporter with WORT.
And hello, everyone. I'm Abigail Becker. I cover local government for the Cap Times and appear weekly on WORT's Downtown Abbey segment each Wednesday.
And before we get started, a few quick notes. You can see all the candidates up for this election, as well as these debates in real time on our website at wortfm.org. Just click the Spring 2021 election tab. There, you can also submit questions for upcoming debates. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to WORT News Director Shali Pittman. That's CHALI at WORTFM.org, or you can call her at 608-321-9586. And now on to the debate.
Yes, to the main debate here today. So our candidates are incumbent Tag Evers and challenger David Hoffert. They are vying to represent District 13. So that's the district that surrounds Monona Bay, runs along Lake Wingra, and includes Edgewood College. It also includes the Bay Creek, Dudgeon Monroe, Greenbush, Monona Bay, Regent, and Vilas neighborhoods.
Since there are only two candidates in this debate, or in this race, the election for the district is on Tuesday, April 6th. That's the day of the spring election. Now let's meet the candidates.
All right, so Tag Evers is the current alder in his first term. Tag has lived in Madison for over 30 years and in District 13 for the last 15 years. He has a master's in applied economics from UW. Tag has been an active participant in the Madison music scene since the early 90s, and he owns his own business that promotes concerts and raises money for local nonprofits. On the City Council, Tag serves on the Board of Public Works, the Sustainable Madison Committee, and the Education Committee. He's also on the boards of the Community Development Authority, Bayview Foundation, and the Henry Vilas Zoo. So thanks so much for joining us today, Tag.
And David Hoffert is a Madison native. He graduated from both Memorial High School and UW-Madison. And in 2021, after earning a Master's of Public Policy degree from Stanford, David came back to Madison. Previously, he served as the president of the Parkwood Hills Community Association and president of the Dudgeon Monroe Neighborhoods Association. David worked with Alder Evers to create the District 13 Alliance. He also helped create the Dudgeon Monroe Neighborhood Association's Anti-Racism Committee. David is a devoted progressive who is running for alder as someone who won't back down from hard decisions needed to make our progressive vision for Madison a reality. Thank you both for joining us today.
So in a moment here, we will turn to the candidates for their opening statements. But first, we have some rules. Each candidate will have 3 minutes per question. And in order to squeeze in a few more questions, when we move to district-specific questions and questions from listeners, you will have 2 minutes per question. And each candidate will have 2 60-second rebuttals to use throughout the debate. So choose when to use them wisely. Opening and closing remarks will be 3 minutes, and your microphone will be muted while the other candidate is speaking.
I will be our timekeeper today. If I hold up this yellow card, you have 30 seconds left to finish your answer. And if you have see this red card, your time is up. Feel free to finish your thought, but don't go much beyond that. We flipped a coin before going. I'll let you go, Abby.
Sorry about that. We did flip a coin, as Jade said, before going live. So first up with opening remarks is Tag. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Jade, and thank you to WRT, and thanks to all of you who are tuning in. And thank you, David, for running. I ran for office 2 years ago, committed to progressive values centered in racial equity, climate justice, and affordable housing. Once elected, I focused on 2 major development projects, Truman Olson and Bayview, both prioritizing low-income families by expanding affordable housing. I'm pleased to say the Truman Olson project is breaking ground this spring with a full-service grocery store, avoiding a food desert on the south side. I sponsored 2 amendments that increased the city's affordable housing fund by $1 million and uncoupled the fund from reliance upon federal tax credits, making the fund more available for cooperatives community land trusts, and nonprofits. I sponsored eviction prevention programs and assistance for first-time home buyers. I serve on the Sustainable Madison Committee and am engaged in multiple efforts to address the climate crisis by focusing on our city's building sector. I oppose the F-35s, the only alder west of the Isthmus to do so. I started the District 13 Neighborhood Alliance to increase communication and cooperation among our district's neighborhood associations. I prevented the Monroe Street Library from closing and resisted efforts to build a football stadium in a residential neighborhood. And I've worked closely with residents to increase safe bicycle and pedestrian access on Vilas Park Drive and within the Triangle. I go to great lengths to communicate with my constituents, posting regularly on my Aldermanic blog, and I've chaired important neighborhood meetings, including a public safety summit last November centering Black voices. I have built strong relationships with city staff, and I've been endorsed by 7 of my fellow council colleagues, including former council president Shiva Badar. I've also been endorsed by 3 current county board supervisors, including District 13 Supervisor Chuck Erickson. 5 former District 13 alders have endorsed me, as has the president of the Vilas Neighborhood Association and the president of the Monona Bay Neighborhood Association. And I've been endorsed by 5 former presidents of the Dungeon Monroe Neighborhood Association. My priorities for the next term are to continue working on affordable housing, racial equity, and climate preparedness. And I'm running for re-election to continue the work I've started.
All right, so you were right on time there, Tag. David, you're up and you have 3 minutes for your opening remarks.
Great. And just one quick correction from the bio. I moved back to Madison in 2012, not 2021, which would have been very recently, but yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Sometimes my numbers just flip, I swear.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to WRT for hosting this. I'm running for alder because every election cycle, we keep talking about the same issues in Madison. It's too expensive for people to live here. We need to do more to combat climate change before it's too late. And our worst in the nation racial disparities aren't getting any better. We keep having the same conversations over and over because Madison leaders are really good at talking about progressive values, but are much less willing to actually do what it takes to solve the problems. Now that disconnect is much bigger than any one person, to be sure, but unfortunately Alder Evers has developed a clear track record of fitting right into that mold of talking big, but then quietly defending the status quo, making excuses, and nibbling around the edges. I'm running for alder to provide real progressive leadership in a city that desperately needs it and wants it. The whole point of my campaign is to go beyond talk and prove that I would bring substance and results to this position. So let me give one specific example right up front here, and then hopefully we'll get into more details over the course of the hour. In 2019, Alder Evers campaigned on the message that climate change was an existential crisis, which it is. Then a report came out 4 months ago that said that Madison ranked 64th out of the top 100 cities in terms of taking action on climate change. Alder Evers went to a meeting of the Vilas Neighborhood Association and said, there's really not much we can do. Our hands are tied by state Republicans. Now, it certainly is true that the state GOP isn't making this any easier on us. But when I'm faced with an existential crisis, I don't spend my time pointing fingers and making excuses. I do anything and everything that I can. And there's a lot that we can do about climate change, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about it more this afternoon. At the end of the day, it comes down to this. Tag, you ran an incredibly inspirational campaign in 2019, talking about it being time for bold action and the need for a moonshot mentality. You inspired a lot of voters. You inspired me. When I lost, obviously I was disappointed, but I meant what I said in my concession letter, that I was incredibly hopeful that you would do amazing things for the city over the next 2 years. And that's why it's so profoundly disappointing that you have shied away from that kind of bold leadership again and again ever since. I do believe that Madison needs bold change and that we don't have 2 years at a time to fritter away. I'm running for alder because if Alder Evers isn't willing to fulfill the mandate he promised, then I am, and I will. I look forward to talking more about what that actually looks like in the coming hour.
Thank you both for your opening statements. You have brought up some specific topics, and I'm happy to say we'll be getting into them over the next few minutes here. A few minutes, more like hour, but we will start to dive right in. Jade, on to you.
All right. So our first question is about equity. A 2013 Race to Equity report found extreme racial disparities in Madison that continue to persist. Candidates, what, if any, tangible changes has the city of Madison made in the last few years, and what tangible steps would you take as an alder to shrink the disparities in our city? David, we will start with you to answer this question. You have 3 minutes.
Great, thank you. The city has certainly done a handful of things to promote equity. Certainly, I think funding affordable housing is itself an equity measure. But frankly, I've been pretty disappointed with what the city has done. And let me actually tell you why I decided to run, because it is an equity issue. And it's actually something that Alder Evers brought up in his opening statement, the Monroe Street Public Library. So obviously, COVID has decimated our city budget. And last summer, Mayor Rhodes Conway asked that all city departments prepare a 5% budget cut. But that's not easy, a 5% budget cut. The Library Commission concluded that they had no choice but to, for only 1 year, shutter at least one branch. And they picked the Monroe Street Public Library branch on the logic that it serves the whitest, wealthiest clientele of anywhere in the city. And also that it's such a small library that you literally can't operate it open during COVID anyway. We were talking about staffing it for curbside service instead of staffing somewhere else for actual library service like internet terminals and so on. Alder Evers came to the Dutch Monroe Neighborhood Association and said, hey, look, this is what equity looks like. This is our chance to live our values. And because he said that, in large part because he said that, as a current board member of the Neighborhood Association, I was able to rally people to support the temporary closure of the library. 2 days later, Alder Evers sends an email saying, hey, I've decided I'm actually going to support keeping it open, and actually implying that we should change our position to align with his. Thankfully, the president of the Neighborhood Association looped me in because she knew that I felt strongly on the issue. And I wrote back and I said, what's changed in the last 2 days? If this was an equity issue 2 days ago, it's an equity issue now. The reason I tell that story is that Madison, nobody wants these racial disparities to persist in Madison. We all know that we're failing in this regard. It's also completely natural when a proposal comes up that would redistribute resources away from what we have to oppose it. What we need in our alder is somebody who will stand up to that and say, wait a second, you do actually want equity in this city. This is what it looks like. This is what we need to do to stay the course and to not cave when that resistance naturally happens. So District 13 needs to be a leader on issues of racial equity precisely because we have such a white, wealthy clientele in our neighborhood. Of course, we also have some incredibly some incredible low-income communities in our district as well. That's the kind of leadership we need to actually stand firm and remind people that, again, we're all in this together.
Thank you for that response. We'll turn to Tag. You have 3 minutes on the question.
Thank you. It's a good question. The Race to Equity report was indeed a shock to many in Madison, but it wasn't a shock to the Black community. The Urban League had been issuing similar reports since the 1980s. Regarding things that we've done, the Civilian Oversight Board is a response to racial equity, and as it was the primary recommendation of the Ad Hoc Committee on Police Policies and Procedures, which started in response to a series of officer-involved fatalities, most notably the killing of Tony Robinson. Another tangible action, we set up the Small Business Equity and Recovery Program to help BIPOC-owned businesses recover from the pandemic. $6.5 million over a 5-year period. And we did this at a time when many claimed that our first priority should be to aid State Street businesses. What tangible things am I doing? And am I committed to continuing to elevate the needs of our district's most vulnerable residents, which is why I've been so focused on the grocery store, as well as amplifying the voices of those who live at Bayview and in the public housing on the triangle. I've made affordable housing a priority because the impact among Black households is most severe. If you accept the notion that no one should have to pay more than 30% of their income on housing, the average Black household cannot afford the average rent of an apartment anywhere in the city. To address this, building intergenerational wealth is key. That's why I've sponsored assistance for first-time home buyers, including a new financial literacy program operated by the Urban League. But let's talk about the library. Yes, at that neighborhood meeting, I spoke about how we have more resilience, obviously, or apparently, in our service area than other service areas in the city, and that we should be willing to take all of the cuts if necessary. But upon further analysis, I found out that there were other options. Now, it may come as some surprise to David that I've learned in my years on this planet that it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's possible to defend Black lives and also to keep a treasured neighborhood library open. So we agreed to take the biggest bulk of the cuts, reducing hours to 3 days a week, because we found out that the library itself was a lifeline to senior citizens, some of whom have no access to other libraries or unable to take a bus. And also in terms of racial equity, kids from Bayview who attend West High School apparently use this library as a place because they don't have good internet access at their home. So David wants to present it as an either or, that you have to do one thing or the other. As an elected leader concerned about equity, it's possible to do both and that's what I did in this particular situation.
Thank you. Before we move on, is there any rebuttals? I'll remind you that you have two 60-second rebuttals. We'll start with David. For a rebuttal, you have 60 seconds.
In general, I agree. We absolutely have to walk and chew gum at the same time. When you're talking about a budget, you literally are putting dollars in one place or another. The fact that people use that library for the internet, yeah, but the library is closed during COVID. And so the idea that's why we should leave it open is missing the point. We, at the end of the day, sometimes it is either or. We have to be willing to put Black lives over white lives in those moments. A few other examples, though. Why are we building the bus rapid transit east-west line before the north-south line? That's another example of actually prioritizing those who are already affluent over those who are not. Why in 2019, when we had a chance to get SROs out of our schools, did Alder Evers speak passionately about the need to get rid of SROs, and then literally 20 minutes later, you can watch the video from July 2nd, 2019, abstain on that vote? It sounds good to say we can have it all, but we aren't having it all. We need to actually commit to that.
Thank you. Tag, would you like to use one of your rebuttals now? All right, we will move on to the next question then.
The COVID-19 pandemic has upended lives, and many of us are grieving loved ones. The pandemic has also caused financial hardship for individuals, small businesses, and local government. Several months ago, the City Council passed a budget that was characterized by the mayor as, quote, painful. We want to ask what you will prioritize for your district and the city with limited resources. So we'll start with Tag this time, and you have 3 minutes.
Well, I think the question is, would we seek to return to normal, or would we work for a new vision for the city? And I think all of us on one level want to return to normal. I, for one, would like to be able to hug people again, to not feel beaten down, not feel overwhelmed. And I think that's what many of us feel. It's interesting that the word apocalypse, which kind of is foreboding, like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the original word in Greek means an unveiling, a revelation. This is not just one pandemic, but several. It's not just one crisis, but a series of compounding, interlocking, and reinforcing crises. And we experience this with the awareness that the dislocation and unrest of this past year may just be a test run for the challenges to be faced in the not too distant future if we don't get a handle on climate change. Our short-term priorities must be addressing the ongoing economic impacts of food and housing insecurity issues. I sponsored an amendment in this last budget for emergency funds for eviction prevention, and this is an area we'll continue to monitor. In addition to the structural housing crisis, this is a looming crisis held back at this point only by the moratorium on evictions. We're going to need to work through this in collaboration with property owners and landlords, and hopefully with sustained support from Washington to avoid housing insecurity on a massive level. Both renters and those they rent from are in jeopardy. We need to move forward with the new men's shelter on the east side. It does not have to be downtown because it's close to transit and big enough that we can move services there so that it's not just a night shelter, it can be a day and night shelter. The redistributive function of government will be more important than ever, so our investment in community services must be prioritized during these tough budget decisions. We need a supportive housing facility for at-risk youth transitioning out of foster care, and we need to invest in our youth, period. These kids who are stealing cars and shooting at each other, they're doing so because they've fallen through the cracks and they've lost all hope for the future. The Streetery program that we set up was a big hit. We should expand it and provide every bit of relief we can to the restaurant industry hanging on by a thread, connecting struggling businesses with services, waiving fees, providing assistance so that we can get through this together, ever mindful of those who are most struggling in our midst. With the pandemic has come a new awareness of the structural challenges we face. Facing these challenges head on, addressing racial and economic disparities, responding to climate change, reinvesting in our communities, embracing a new vision for a Madison that works for everyone. That's my goal, and that's what I'm sure that David is committed to as well.
Great, thank you, Tag. And David, you are up next, and you also have 3 minutes.
Thank you. The most important thing that we can do about the COVID pandemic right now is to make sure it ends as soon as it possibly can. And I know that sounds like, okay, great. What does Madison have to do with that? Madison can be playing a part in making sure that vaccinations are happening quickly, both in terms of the logistics of how Madison healthcare providers are distributing vaccines, but also just in terms of a public education campaign. We know that there are quite a few people in our midst who either are skeptical of the vaccine or don't know how to get it, haven't gotten the connections in place to have access to it. Madison actually can be playing a part in making sure that people get vaccinated as quickly as they can. And at the end of the day, there's nothing more important we can do than actually putting an end to the pandemic once and for all. The question was about what are you going to prioritize in a tight budget? And it's true that we're going to be in a tight budget situation, not just this year, but for several years to come. Right? This is going to be kind of a lingering effect of the pandemic, even when hopefully we were healthy and able to, as Tag said, hug people again. A lot of the things that Tag just talked about would cost a lot of money. And so it's all well and good to say that we're going to do those things, but indeed, where does the money come from? I want to focus on the things that we can do that will make a difference that don't cost a lot of money. So for example, in terms of affordable housing, if you put money into the Affordable Housing Fund, that money has to come from somewhere. But if you reform the zoning code to actually incentivize affordable housing, the city's not spending anything, and yet it can actually probably be more effective at building affordable housing than just by putting money passively in a fund waiting for people to apply for it. In terms of climate change, we can take the Madison solar program, which is this group buy that encourages people to put rooftop solar on the roofs, but it doesn't cost the city much money. It costs something to coordinate the process, but it doesn't cost much because we're not buying the solar panels. And we can do that for geothermal. We can do that for electric heat pumps. We can do that for electric car charging stations in garages. At the end of the day, in all of these priority areas, there are opportunities through policy, through creative and innovative policy, to actually accomplish a lot of our goals without it costing a lot of money. And frankly, that's a good thing to do even when we're not in a pandemic budget situation. But it's especially important now when so many things could be said. We could say, well, I'd love to do that, but we don't have the money. No, we have to do what we can, and there's plenty that we can do on all of these areas to help people rebound from this terrible economic situation.
And thank you for those comments, David. Would either of you like to offer any rebuttals at this time?
All right,
Okay.
seeing none, we'll move on to our next question, which is about policing. So the City Council has recently created a civilian oversight board and an independent police monitor position. Alders limited what and how much the Madison Police Department can receive from federal military surplus programs. They rejected a partial grant to fund more police officer positions, and there's currently a proposal to ban or restrict the use of tear gas. In 2021, we will also see a pilot crisis response unit for behavioral health emergencies. What do you think of these recent steps made by the council? And what, if any, additional police reforms do you support given the protests against police violence and several nights of civil unrest downtown this summer? We start with David on this question. You have 3 minutes.
The Civilian Oversight Board and the Independent Monitor were incredibly important steps, and I'm glad they happened. And I'm afraid that Madison is now going to pat itself on the back. Oh, good, we took care of police reform and we're good to go. The reality is that both the Civilian Oversight Board and the Independent Monitor and most of the other things that you just listed are inherently reactive. If, God forbid, somebody is shot and killed by police, they might have the ability to provide some measure of justice after the fact. That's not good enough. We need to proactively prevent terrible situations like that from happening in the first place. I support defunding the police. I support the idea that we should have a comprehensive public safety budget. And we need police for some things. God forbid, if there's a mass shooting, we need a police response for that. We don't need a police response for nonviolent mental health crises. We don't need a police response for substance abuse issues. We do need a response. We need a social services response. And if we view public safety as a comprehensive system, where funding goes to the appropriate service that's needed, we're not talking about reducing public safety funding. We're talking about allocating it to where it would be best used and where it would make all of us safer. Right? Paul Heenan in 2012 was white. This is not just a Black Lives Matter issue. This is a public safety issue. And we can, frankly, probably save some money, but also make everybody safer by having a comprehensive approach to this issue. Alder Evers, in his League of Women Voters interview that just went on the air, called defund the police a controversial term that we should probably stop using. I'm not going to back away from that term. I am going to define it and make sure people recognize that we should all be supporting a comprehensive review of public safety. It's now been almost exactly 8 months since those protests started in Madison specifically. The fact that none of the alders, Alder Evers, or anybody else, this is not just his fault by any means, have even called for a task force to come up with how we would actually do this. One pilot program on one particular issue isn't going to cut it. We could be sitting down and crafting a budget for this before Mayor Rhodes Conway's 2022 operating budget comes out. By the time it comes out, it's going to be too late to make meaningful changes to it. But if we start now, we could get something done, and we have to. It's frankly embarrassing to me that. So what have we done? We voted on one budget amendment that would have arbitrarily slashed police funding to balance the city budget last year. That's not what defund the police means, and that's not going to build any broad-based support for what needs to happen to reform public safety in Madison.
Thank you, David. Tag, we will move to you. You have 3 minutes on police policy and reform.
Thank you. I strongly support the Civilian Oversight Board, and David apparently is uninformed. The COB is not just a reactive body responding to complaints. It's charged with oversight of policies and procedures and with making recommendations for changes. It makes recommendations. It'll be reviewing training. like de-escalation training? What are policies around use of force? What are the policies about wellness in terms of how cops are taking care of themselves with respect to PTSD? It's not going to just respond to complaints. He apparently hasn't studied up on the Civilian Oversight Board. He's not been a longtime member of the community resource team. It was Paul Heenan, my friend, who got killed in 2012, which formed the impetus for the community resource team that worked in the community and helped get the ad hoc committee going, which led to the creation of the Civilian Oversight Board. I also, of course, support the crisis response unit. I took a ride along with the police a couple years ago, and during that 4-hour period, all but one of the calls were a mental health call. So there's no reason why we should be sending an armed police officer to a mental health call when we should be and can be and will be with this crisis response unit, sending a mental health specialist or a substance abuse specialist. And it does start with asking what the police are doing that we no longer want them to do, and then identifying the agencies and the entities that are better suited for the task. Now, David, in his response to the League of Women Voters, suggested that we should look at traffic enforcement and have someone else do that. But we've already looked into that, David. We've already looked into it as the Progressive Dane Caucus, and unfortunately, state statute does not allow us to do that. And that's something that we can change and trying to work with the state. But sworn officers are the only ones who can issue traffic citations, unlike in England, which has a separate unarmed force. One area that we can be working on, and believe me, alders and particularly the Progressive Dane Caucus are looking at community safety workers. And that's why I'm a big supporter of the Focus Interruption Coalition, and we'll be pushing to increase funding so that they don't just do reactive work after shots are fired, but can do proactive work and community building and dealing with situations when hotspots are beginning to arise. We've had a couple of those hotspots in District 13 around Olin and South Park and in Brittingham Park. We need unarmed, respected community safety workers who can engage and help de-escalate these situations. I'm open to any kind of task force, but the suggestion in the absence of the task force, this work is not being done, is simply not true.
Thank you. Before we move on, is there any rebuttals? All right, David, this is your last 60-second rebuttal, okay?
I know. I'm going all in right up front.
All right.
Yeah. Look, Tag, I think you and I agree on more than we disagree on this issue. We clearly both want police reform to happen. A lot of the things you just said are good. The fact that there's not a comprehensive look at it happening, right? We had a budget that came up in October and November of this last year, months after the protests, and what did we get? We got a pilot program for one mental health ambulance. We don't have time to kind of trickle away at it and do, we'll do a little bit here, a little bit there. We might defund the police 10 years from now at that rate. That's not good enough. So I think we share similar goals. What I'm saying is we need a sense of urgency that I'm not seeing happening on the city council right now. And we know what we have to do. We have the data. This could be a data-driven policy analysis. How much money is currently going to mental health response, and therefore how much money is available? And frankly, it doesn't even have to be an anti-police thing, right? We can actually have police responding to what they are best at. But it's all talk and no action until we actually put the process together.
Thank you, David. Tag, would you like to use one of your rebuttals here? All right. That brings us on to our next question, which we are going to stick with the topic of policing. About 2 weeks ago, the city committee tasked with taking on the issue of body cameras decided 5-1 to recommend body camera pilot program. The city has been discussing body cameras for Madison's police force since at least 2015. Do you support body cameras? Yes or no? And please explain your answer. Since this is a follow-up question, we are going to keep the time to just 2 minutes. Tag, we'll start with you.
Thank you. It's a good question. The script is flipped on body-worn cameras. At first, body-worn cameras were supported by police reform advocates who saw them as a means to hold officers accountable. And police, though, generally didn't want them. They were resistant to the idea of accountability. But it's kind of switched. The police, by and large, now want them because they see body cameras as a means of gathering evidence and perhaps protecting themselves from unfounded claims of misconduct. Activists have also changed their position, concerned that the cameras will lead to higher rates of conviction for minor offenses in communities that are already disproportionately caught up in the criminal justice system, which is an issue. If you were second in the country in terms of the mass incarceration, the rate of incarceration for young Black males. So no wonder activists are concerned. I'm also concerned is that the studies show that the benefits are mixed, that body-worn cameras do not reduce the lethal use of force and other measures of police violence. But I'm mainly concerned about the cost. I've seen estimates as high as $4 million per year. And in a time of tight budgets, and given the fact that the benefits are mixed, I'm not in favor of moving forward with body-worn cameras at this time.
Thank you for that answer. David, you have 2 minutes on body cameras.
I think Alder Evers and I are very aligned on this issue. I probably won't use my full 2 minutes because I agree with just about everything he said. I want to kind of put it in a different order. I think my main concern with body cameras is the idea that at a time that we're talking about how much we spend on public safety and how little we spend on other social services, the idea of pouring a lot more money into policing, instead that money, again, back to that walk and chew gum at the same time here, again, as a trade-off, that money could go to other services instead, services that either are better providing public safety or are providing economic support and economic possibilities to get us out of the crime cycle in the first place. That would be a much better use of that money. So I believe that we need accountability for police. I believe that we can achieve accountability in other ways besides body cameras and use those limited financial resources to actually build a more just system at a fundamental level.
Thank you both. And just to make sure, no rebuttals on this question. All right, we'll move to Abby with the environment.
Yes, now we are turning to the environment, as Jade said. This question was submitted by 350 Madison, a local group committed to raising awareness of the need to address climate change. Local leadership makes many decisions that affect the climate, from development and transportation to stormwater runoff and flooding. The folks at 350 Madison ask, if elected, how will you help Madison adapt to climate change impacts we are already experiencing in this city? So now we start with David, who has 3 minutes.
Yeah, so let's talk about the climate impacts we're already experiencing in this city, because 2 years ago we had a major flood in this city. It was interesting. There was that piece on CBS Sunday Morning a few weeks ago about Madison being a climate haven, one of the few in the country. And Mayor Rhodes Conway, I assume it was just trying to make a joke, but she went out to the lakes and was asked about flooding in Madison, and she said, "Well, I don't think those lakes are going anywhere." But they did go somewhere 2 years ago, and many people in District 13 were materially impacted by those floods. I was on the far west side of Madison running an errand with my wife and my then 1-year-old son, and we couldn't get home. Every intersection in Madison was flooded, and we got stranded. Thankfully, we had some quick thinking and realized that we knew somebody right where we were, and we slept in their basement that night. And I walked a block down to Walgreens to get a breast pump and diapers and bottles for my son. This is real. And I mean, yeah, I think Madison's a better place to live than many places for this, but this is real and it's happening. The time is now to do something about it. The question was about how to prevent the effects that are already happening. After that flooding occurred, city engineering put together a long list of infrastructure improvements that we needed in order to better handle that kind of water flow in the future. We're not funding those projects nearly fast enough to actually prevent this from happening the next time we have a 100-year flood event, which, let's be clear, what a 100-year rain event, it's not going to be 100 years before that happens again. The 100 years is based on historical averages. It's going to happen again soon. We need to be ready for it, and we're not taking it seriously enough. So that, I mean, that's, I think, the clear example of how to adapt to what's already happening. We also need to not take our foot off the gas. That's a terrible analogy for this, but not take our foot off the gas for fighting climate change from getting even worse. I mentioned my proposal about taking the Madison solar program and using that model in several other places so that we can get better energy efficiency in our homes. We also need to continue investing in public transit so that we can get cars off the roads. That means, yes, building bus rapid transit, but having more frequent routes for all buses, not just bus rapid transit, and having better coverage in marginalized communities for those bus routes. It means making riding the bus a more pleasant experience, having Wi-Fi on board maybe, so that, like, even if you have a longer commute, you can still be productive during that time. We also need to have a much stronger electric car charging infrastructure in the city than we currently do. Details matter here. Level 2 chargers are not the same thing as level 3 chargers. We have one level 3 charger in the entire city. We should have one in every gas station in this city. That's how we're going to actually allow people to adopt energy saving measures like electric vehicles.
All right, thank you, David. And on to you, Tag. You also have 3 minutes for this question.
Thank you. I serve on the Sustainable Madison Committee, and we're in the process of rewriting the city's sustainability plan to be an actionable document to accelerate progress to our 2030 goals of 100% renewables and net zero carbon emissions. I sponsored the updating of our stormwater ordinances requiring developers to treat stormwater on site, and I sponsored the Wingra watershed study to address how climate change is impacting Lake Wingra. Scientists tell us that we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 in order to avoid catastrophic impacts from climate change. I'm a part of a working group of fellow alders, Sustainable Madison Committee members and members of the Plan Commission to address sustainability in the context of our built environment. 48% of the city's emissions are from its commercial and residential building stock. To get to where we need to be will require innovative policy and programmatic action. Most of the buildings we have today will be here in 2050, and new buildings, as the city grows, will last into the next century. We need to build for a sustainable future, one in which our social habits conform to ecological necessity. We have the resources as a city to be a climate leader, and it's my intention to keep us pushing to the top. Now, regarding what David has suggested is that I've thrown in the towel in some ways. If David had actually attended a single meeting of the Sustainable Madison Committee over the last 2 years, he would have learned why we had that rating of 64. Stacy Reese, who is the city's sustainability director, had repositioned, I guess, to get ready for the April spring elections, reassigned as it was, and did not respond to the questionnaire. Had she responded to the questionnaire, we would have been as high as Milwaukee, quite likely. But why was Milwaukee so low? Because it is true that the state's building code preempts local authority. That doesn't mean we make an excuse and that we can't do anything, but it does mean, and that the meetings that I have with the mayors, the deputy mayor, and that we have in this working group, and that we have at Sustainable Madison Committee, we often have to invite the city attorney's office to explain just what that we can do. But taking something that was said out of context at a neighborhood meeting and suggesting that I've thrown in the towel and making excuses for where we are is just something somebody does during a campaign, but it doesn't reflect accurately as to what I said and the work that I'm doing now. Again, David hasn't showed up at these committee meetings. He doesn't bring his ideas to the table. He doesn't bring his ideas to transportation committee meetings, even though he asked to be assigned to one. He hasn't shown up in one in 2 years. So somebody is talking a lot, but they certainly aren't following through with community action.
All right, thanks, Tag, and that's time. And I would ask for rebuttals, but I know, David, you used both of yours, just to double check, right, Jade? I'm not losing track. All right, so moving on to the next question, one specific to the district. The debate over Edgewood and its stadium has been, needless to say, a big topic in the neighborhood for quite some time. Most recently, the City Council upheld the Plan Commission's denial of a permit that would have allowed the near West Side Private Catholic High School to install 4 field lights, which would have led the way for games at nighttime. Do you think this was the right decision? How do you think the neighborhood, city, and Edgewood could have handled the situation better? And moving forward, how would you as Alder seek to repair these relationships if you do believe they need to be repaired? All right, so we're going to start with Tag on this question, who has 2 minutes.
Thank you. Obviously, this has taken up a lot of attention in District 13. I have not changed my position. And 2 years ago, I saw this as an incompatible use in a traditional residential neighborhood. I remain committed to that position. Edgewood would point to other stadiums like Memorial High School and say we should be able to do what they're doing. But it's just not realistic. David, on the other hand, has changed his position. 2 years ago, he said he looked forward to the day where he could bring his son to a home football game there and cheer for the home team. And he also suggested as a possible compromise that we increase double or triple the size of the stadium there to accommodate West High School. West High School has got 4 or 5 times the student population. They get along just fine with having a remote football field over at Memorial High School. And they've never really asserted themselves as this is a privilege, this is a right, that this is something we need to be doing. David, though, he's changed his position on this, and I'm glad that he's come alongside. He's changed his position on many areas, and I'm glad for the progress that he's made. I've remained consistent on this, and I'm open to a compromise, but compromise means that you have to be willing to come halfway, and Edgewood has not been willing to do that. They insist on, from a place of entitlement, that they should be able to do what these other high schools doing, even though the circumstances are entirely different. So I do agree that the Common Council made the right decision in turning down the appeal. The Plan Commission made the right decision. And if there's going to be progress here, it'll be because Edgewood actually comes back to the table and listens to the neighborhood and studies the existing use and on the noise impacts and shows some willingness to invest in the type of screening that could mitigate, bring down the sound level, several dBs, so it would be tolerable. But no, why be in such a hurry? This has been a controversy for 25 years. Let's not insist on trying to resolve it immediately. Let's come back to the table and discuss it. Or if Edgewood, if they realize that it's just not possible, maybe they could do what the college has done, which is to invest in an athletic facility out where it doesn't impact nearby neighbors. And they've done this out in Verona at the Redden Field. So there are options. If you start with compromise, you're probably going to lose. I'm concerned if David had been elected 2 years ago, this stadium would have been built by now. You have to find your position of strength and negotiate from there. And I think I provided the kind of leadership that helped this neighborhood accomplish its goals, which was to ask Edgewood to be responsible with the use of their resources.
All right, thank you, Tag. And David, you are up with 2 minutes for this question.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we're both going to spend the debate accusing each other of taking each other out of context. So that'll have to be what it is. I did not support that stadium 2 years ago. I did support compromise. That is true. I supported trying to get people to sit down together and figure out whether it was possible to work something out. I am not ashamed of changing my position on this issue. I think that's what a leader does. When new information presents itself, you have to be willing to adapt. In this case, I supported compromise, which, as Tag said, means both parties being willing to work together and find common ground. Edgewood has proven again and again ever since that they have no interest in doing that. The final straw for me was when they sued the city for religious discrimination over this issue. Say what you will about why people oppose the stadium and whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea. It's not because Edgewood is Catholic. And as a Jew, as somebody who has actually experienced directed at me, anti-Semitism in my life, I was so offended by the idea that they would sue over religious discrimination that was it. So, Alder Evers also accused me of not showing up to meetings. Well, I have showed up to meetings on this. I've testified in support of the things that Alder Evers has done about Edgewood. In fact, he's thanked me and asked me to show up, and I've done so. I was at that meeting a couple weeks ago, and I actually used the fact that I had supported compromise 2 years ago to make the point that Edgewood is driving people away who were, more middle ground before, and that's proof that they're not committed to actually working through this with the neighborhood. At this point, Edgewood has exactly one thing they need to do to get the possibility of this stadium back on the table, and that is to regain the trust of the neighbors. I know the neighbors. I was president of this neighborhood association for 2 years. I know the people who will give me an honest appraisal of when Edgewood is actually coming to the table in a meaningful way. If they were to say to me that Edgewood is back in the game and we should, that's another terrible analogy, back in the game and we should, talk to them, great, of course, but it's going to come from the neighbors. The neighbors have to have that trust regained. And, I think Edgewood thinks that they can do that in a few days or a few months. I think it's going to take years at this point to rebuild that relationship, and that has to be the number one priority. In terms of, handling it differently, here's what I'll say. We've had this kind of scorched earth back and forth over the last 2 years. It's cost us something real. We lost the master plan out of this. All of the other projects that could have been collaborative and that were codified through our relationship with Edgewood, that's all gone now. And Edgewood is proving that they have no interest in actually honoring those projects independently. That's too bad. And so I do think that a different approach could have hopefully prevented this incompatible use, but also retained what is good about the relationship as well.
And that's time. Thank you both so much. And for those strict timekeepers at home who are following along, we accidentally let both candidates go 3 minutes for that question, but each did receive equal time for it. So moving on, Tag, would you like to offer one of your 2 remaining rebuttals? And that's a no. All right, thank you again.
All right, and our next district-specific question, this time I will keep it to 2 minutes. This question is submitted by a member of the Duggan Monroe Neighborhood Association. They ask, what are your best ideas to increase affordability and density in our neighborhood, where much of the area is zoned for single family and where low-income families are frequently prevented from moving because of high housing costs? We'll start with David. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. Again, this is another area where Alder Evers and I differ. Well, let's start with where we agree. The affordability in this city is terrible. The affordability in the Duggan Monroe neighborhood is terrible. There's a house that I can literally see out of my back window that sold last year for $780,000. Right? Who can possibly move into this neighborhood unless they're 2 doctors in the family, right? That's not going to do anything, certainly, to dismantle the terrible segregation that we have in this city. That is the root of so many problems. I have proposed actually actively building affordable housing in our neighborhood. When you have this affordable housing fund that Alder Evers has indeed added funding to over the last 2 years, that allows developers to pick their own project and apply for the money. And therefore, even though, sure, we're approving some projects and rejecting others, it's a fundamental process that's directed by the developer. You better believe we're going to be building affordable housing in already low-income areas of the city. If we actually want to actively desegregate the city, we need to actively build affordable housing on wealthy corridors like Monroe Street. I proposed that 2 years ago. I proposed redeveloping the Monroe Street Public Library to add affordable housing. Alder Evers' response was, well, I think it would be more appropriate to build affordable senior housing on that site. Affordable housing is affordable housing. I don't know what that message was supposed to mean. I don't like the sound of it. It sounds like a dog whistle to me. We need to be committed to building affordable housing, and to the point of the person who asked the question, we need to be willing to actually loosen up our zoning code. And yes, single family zoning is problematic. I would support getting rid of single family zoning entirely.
Thank you for that answer. We will move to Tag. You have 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. David has suggested this. He says, do what Minneapolis did. Let's be bold. But if we are bold in this instance, it may actually exacerbate our problems. It's not enough to just allow more housing. You have to pair it with other policies that will make housing that is built affordable. We can't require it. So the surest way to do that is to directly fund it. And the next best way is to incentivize it. And if you don't pair it with either of those, the result will be unaffordable multifamily housing that replaces unaffordable single housing, while low-income folks continue to be pushed to the perimeter, to the periphery. The ordinance change that we're discussing right now is just a first step. It lays the groundwork for what we could do in residential neighborhoods, but alone it's not going to solve the affordable housing issue. It's complicated. It's very nuanced, and it doesn't lend itself to broad brush solutions. I know that staff's very cautious about this notion of an overlay district, having an alternate code for affordable housing where we maintain exclusionary restrictions for market rate housing, but allow affordable housing developers to proceed by right. We need to expand our land banking policy, pursuing parcels in high opportunity areas, areas with amenities like transit, jobs, food, schools, but not necessarily in wealthy areas. There are opportunity costs. If a 2-acre parcel on Cottage Grove Road costs half as much as the same size parcel on Monroe Street, we need to consider the wisest use of our scarce resources. Eastmoreland, where that neighborhood is also 90% white. We don't have the luxury of just investing in wealthy neighborhoods, assuming that white is better. People want to live where they want to live, and the needs are actually greatest right now in South Madison, and that's where we need to be making our investments and to prevent. Okay, like I could just finish this sentence.
Okay, yeah.
To deal with gentrification and displacement.
Thank you. Tag, you do still have 2 60-second rebuttals if you would like to spend 60 seconds more on this topic.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I will. I'll talk 60 seconds more. I was talking with Brandy Grayson the other night about this, and I was reminded of a quote by Stokely Carmichael back in the 60s, where he said the problem with racial integration and the absence of Black empowerment is that it typically ends up being a one-way street, with Black families moving into white neighborhoods and Black kids going to white schools, and never the other way around. Again, people have their own family ties and social ties, and if we start with the assumption that white is better, instead of really investing in Black neighborhoods and Black families and Black institutions, that's the challenge right now in South Madison. That's where the need is greatest in order to stand in the way of gentrification and displacement, in order to prepare for the 5,000 new residents coming from the town of Madison in less than 2 years, many of them who are low income. So I'd say that our priorities need to be investing continually in South Madison. And David's wrong. There is affordable housing throughout the city right now. You should look at the map of the current sites that have been funded by the Affordable Housing Fund.
Thank you for that answer. We will move to our next question.
Yes, and these are some listener questions. So Gail, shout out Gail, hope you're listening. Gail submitted this question before the debate, and we've modified it slightly. This is a district with a lot of big crucial issues happening. We've got the Vilas Park plan underway, the Park Street grocery store issue, which was mentioned earlier, Monroe Street library hours also mentioned, and those are just to name a few. If you are elected, how do you plan to balance being present for all of those district issues and projects with your commitments to, broader council citywide issues? How will you plan to, be present at, all that you feel you need to be present at as an alder? We'll start with Tag on this one, who has 2 minutes.
Thank you. That's a really good question. My experience on being an alder is that you're wearing multiple hats. A big part of your job are responding to constituent concerns. You get a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls and people who have either a complaint or a concern, and you need to respond to that. Just people need to feel like they're being represented. But it's also true that the loudest voices aren't the only voices that count. As an alder, you need to think about the people who are not in the room, who are not being represented. And it's also very important to, as you're trying to represent the shared values of your district, to think in terms of what's good for the broader community, what's good for the city as a whole. Voice is definitive of participatory democracy, and it's important to take into consideration all points of view, but voice does not mean veto. So it's really important as an alder to be able to bring people together, but to keep things on track in terms of being able to get this grocery store built so that we didn't end up with a gap in services. It was important for me to exercise the kind of leadership that kept us on track and kept us on, focused on our agenda, so it didn't get delayed. And sometimes you end up pushing hard and people get offended and you realize, okay, there's a balance between being inclusive and responsible and equitable, and also making sure that the broader concerns of the city get attended to. And that's the challenge with neighborhood associations and vocal groups. They sometimes have kind of narrow parochial concerns. And we need, as elected officials, to be responsible, to speak for the common good, and to speak boldly, yes, as David said, and to think in terms of what's good for our entire community, what's good for the planet, what's good, and what will help us move forward as a city.
Thank you, Tag. David, on to you. You have got 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, Tag obviously can speak with great experience about just how many hours it takes on a weekend and weekend basis to do this job. The first answer to the question is of how are you going to balance spending your time on local issues versus broad city issues is yes, you have to do both. I think this is a 10-hour-a-week position on paper. It's not a 10-hour-a-week position, right? And you have to go into this job with your eyes wide open that you'll be spending 25 to 30. I'm curious if Tag has a different number than that from his experience, but 25 to 30 hours or more, okay, a week doing this work. I'm going in with my eyes wide open. I understand that this would be, other than my gainful employment, the only thing I would be doing. And I've made a promise to my family that I will spend Friday nights with them. Like, that's it, right? I mean, so this is not for the faint of heart. The other point I want to make, though, is I think there's less of a gap between local concerns and broad city concerns than we make it out to be. So, the examples that were given, Vilas Park Master Plan, that is fundamentally a citywide concern about how do we prioritize recreation opportunities in this city, and how do we prioritize the environment in this city. The grocery store, that's about food access in the city. It's about affordable housing in the city. You can wear both of those hats at the same time. You can walk and chew gum at the same time, to use my favorite quote from Alder Evers tonight so far. And you have to, because again, when you separate out the local concerns from the broader concerns, that's when you end up with situations like, well, I'm going to actually promote keeping the Monroe Street Library open this year, even though I know that on the broader picture, the right thing to do for the city is to close it. We have to actually unify those concerns and keep everybody on the same page.
And that's time. Thank you. Again, Tag, just a reminder, you still have one more 60-second rebuttal opportunity.
I just want to correct David on one thing. It's not true that the Monroe Street Library is going to remain closed for the entire year and people will not be able to enjoy it. Those kids from Bayview coming back from West High at some point this year may very well be able to use the computers there. And so, again, this either or insistence that somehow or another I'm only listening to rich white folks, which you have said online, I think is belied by the facts. And you should get phone calls from seniors who are crying because The library is actually their lifeline. They don't have anywhere else to go. They're not willing to get on a bus during COVID, and they can't drive. So this idea that it was either one or the other is simply not true, and it's not really what leadership is about. You have to figure out how you can move forward in an effective way. And this was done with the mayor, and this was done with the library board, and this was done with the library director, Greg Mickles. It wasn't me just doing it on my own. Thanks.
It's going to happen once each debate that I'm going to forget to unmute myself. We're moving on to questions that are submitted during this debate by listeners. So Stu on Facebook asks, in a related question to the conversation we were just having, what is your position on the proposal to reduce the council to 10 alders, each paid a $70,000 annual salary with 4-year terms and a 2-term limit? Let's start with David, who has 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm really happy that when the council put this on the ballot for April, that they separated it into 4 separate questions, because it's really important that we be able to think about whether we support increasing the pay of alders separately from reducing the number of alders and so on. Specifically, I strongly support making the alder position a full-time job. If you think about who in our community has the luxury of spending 25 or 30 or more, as Alder Ever says, hours per week, only on evenings and weekends, doing this work for, what is it now, $13,000 a year. And therefore, I mean, you have to have some other kind of either wealth or gainful employment. And it has to conform with the hours of this job. There's a very small sliver of people with privilege in our community who can even consider taking on the role of an alder. Look at this. You've got 2 white guys from Dudgeon Monroe. 2 years ago, it was 4 white guys running for this seat, right? If we actually want equity, not just in, oh yes, please come and testify at a city council meeting, but actually please be the person who has the power and who's casting the votes, we need to be willing to reform the city council and make it a living wage. That said, if you were to reduce the number of alders from 20 to 10, you would very quickly undermine those equity gains, those representation gains that you had achieved by increasing the pay. So I support increasing the pay. Let's be clear about something that would not benefit me. If I had to quit my full-time job to be an alder, I don't think I could do it, because it would be a significant pay cut for me. In fact, the fact that it would not benefit me is why I know it's the right thing to do. I support making it full-time. I do not support reducing the number of alders. We have to be willing to put our money where our mouth is and prioritize representation.
Thank you. Tag, we'll move to you. You have 2 minutes on this question.
Thanks. There's general agreement that the current aldermanic salary is not enough. As David indicated, it usually requires that somebody get a day job, and it creates equity considerations for those, who simply cannot run and cannot afford to. And it's also true that having part-time alders contributes toward a weak legislative body, particularly in comparison to the executive branch, because the mayor is a full-time position, and she's got 4 deputy mayors and support staff. And it's true that in Madison, historically, mayors have tended to view the council as an obstacle to legislative progress instead of partners. That said, I'm concerned about raising the pay to as high as $70,000. $70,000 is more than what state senators make in our state. And I do think it's somewhat being oversold, this idea that this in of itself would be curative to equity challenges in our city. And so while I support moving toward a full-time council, I think that we should approach it perhaps more slowly. I don't know, do we double or triple the salary as opposed to going all the way up to a five-fold increase? I'm concerned that in the absence of public financing of elections, we might be contributing to some unintended consequences. Meanwhile, I'm very encouraged that we have more BIPOC candidates running for office than ever before. And I'm quite certain that this renewed enthusiasm to getting involved are not just from privileged people. As I'm very excited, should I be reelected, to work with these new colleagues who are going to really shake things up. So I'm glad it's an advisory referendum, and I'm somewhat ambivalent about this notion of immediately going to a full-time council, a professional council, but I'm glad that we're having this discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Moving on to another question from a listener. Catherine from Madison, hey Catherine, emailed us during the debate. Since Wisconsin statutes mandate that local governments cannot write regulations that are stricter than state laws, how will you manage to get more environmentally sound practices than the weaker state regulations allow? For example, Madison cannot mandate solar on new building projects. Tag, I believe you're up first on this one, and you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we can do, if I understand the question correctly, how do we get around this strict building code? I've been invited by the mayor to participate in a major initiative looking at the built environment. The built environment, we have 48% of our emissions come from the building sector. And one of the things that have been discussed in the past that we're looking at is called benchmarking, requiring businesses to submit the data about the energy they use. That was voted down by the Chamber of Commerce with the pressure, who endorsed David in his last campaign. They had a very targeted business sense, and they didn't think that that would be good. But maybe they've changed by now, and we'll see with the climate emergency that they need to be involved. Other ideas that are being considered would be requiring businesses every 5 years to undergo an energy assessment according to international standards on energy efficiency. And they would have the information of what kinds of things that could be done and the payback that they would get from it. And it's estimated that carbon emissions can be reduced by as much as 15%. Retro-commissioning, otherwise known as tune-ups, is another idea, where every 2 years requiring businesses to test their existing systems to see if they're efficient and if they run well. And yes, David's idea about air source heat pumps are a really good idea, but currently right now, Focus on Energy does not give you rebates if you're switching fuel sources. If you have a natural gas furnace, you cannot get a rebate by switching over to a heat pump. And the technology doesn't work all that well now, particularly for really cold situations like a polar vortex. So we're meeting with Tyler Hebner, the Governor Ebener's appointment to the PSC, I believe, in 2 weeks, to be able to see what we can do to influence the Focus on Energy to be more aggressive and be more engaged on this particular topic.
All right, right on time there, Tag. David, moving to you, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I want to go back to the example that I gave and that Alder Evers just invoked about we don't need to be able to do mandates on the building code to make a huge difference on energy use. And so, okay, so Alder Evers wants to dispute heat pumps, but again, things like geothermal, things like other energy efficient measures, you can make it very attractive for both a residential customer and a business customer to make those improvements without mandating anything. And frankly, the only thing that we're missing is the will to do so, to be creative in that way. I also think this is an opportunity to go back and talk about zoning code, right? So Alder Evers mentioned earlier that that just allowing for higher density building doesn't actually increase affordability, right? Which is why we need to have a zoning code that actually incentivizes things like green energy. And again, not mandate, but incentivize. I think it's interesting that he made that point when the zoning reform that he is currently supporting does not actually incentivize anything about affordability or green energy. So I agree that we need to more forcefully use our zoning code. Again, falling short of mandates, but just making it easier to get through the process if you do green energy, if you do affordability. And we're not. And the ordinance that Alder Evers is currently sponsoring fails to do exactly that point. So how are we going to do it? We have to be willing to do it. And this idea that, oh, if we go too far, we might get sued. Let's walk that line. Let's push the boundary. Let's actually make them sue us if it comes down to that. I'd rather defend a good policy in court than never have done the right thing and never have actually improved our environment.
Thank you both for your answers to that question. We didn't give you a warning, but we are officially at the end of our debate. So we're on to the point of final remarks. Before we get there, I want to thank you both for joining us. And for our closing remarks, we will begin with David Hoffert. You have 3 minutes, David.
Thank you. Thank you to Jade and to Abby for hosting this. Thank you for WORT for providing this. As Abby said, I think it was before we went on the air, like WORT is so far ahead in terms of getting these conversations happening. And I really appreciate that, right? Because it's hard during a polar vortex to get people to pay attention to a local race, and raising awareness of the issues that we've been talking about today is so important. And thank you to Alder Evers for a vigorous debate. Another thing that we said off camera before we got started is we like each other. At least I like you. I hope you still like me, Tag. And frankly, I consider you a friend. I'm running because we need to keep pushing those boundaries. We need to keep pushing those envelopes. And, you're right. I haven't been older the last 2 years. I haven't had to have the conversations with the city attorney's office and the different stakeholder groups about why we should actually be careful here or, do something incremental there. But the result has been that for the last 2 years, this city council has done almost nothing. This city council is so much more interested in scoring political points and virtue signaling, and just in terms of, count up the actual number of policies passed over the last 2 years as opposed to in previous terms. We need to get back to a place where local politics isn't about the mudslinging. It's about putting your head down and doing the work. And I'm somebody who would be perfectly happy to never get credit for any of the work I do in this role. I just want to get it done. If we actually want to solve these challenges that are intense, right? Again, we have the worst racial disparities in the country. We have climate change that is bearing down on us, and there's now 9 years left before we're past the point of no return. We don't have time for half measures. We don't have time for second guessing. We just have to act. And I hope that whoever wins this race, that we are more committed to putting that policy-centric focus. Again, it has to not just be about sound bites. It has to be about getting the job done. I bring with me the experience of having a Master of Public Policy degree, of actually crafting the legislation. I think there are a lot of issues that Alder Evers has voted the right way on. I wish he had introduced more legislation himself. I wish he was driving the conversation in a way that I just haven't seen. And that's why I'm running. That's why I hope to, for those who are tuning in, to earn their support on April 6th.
Thank you, David. Tag Evers, your closing statement. You have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jade, for pulling this together, and Abby for joining in and helping to moderate this discussion. And special thanks to my favorite public and community radio station, WORT, and to all of you who are watching and will be watching in the weeks to come. I also want to thank David for running and for encouraging me to do more. I have to admit, it does kind of feel like he's doing this from the bleachers that he's occupied for the past 2 years, while I and my colleagues have been in the trenches working for our community during one of the most challenging periods in our city's history. But I prefer this version of David than the one who ran against me 2 years ago. That David Hoffert ran as a centrist, a moderate, endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce and our conservative paper of record. I'm glad that he's done what looks to be a 180-degree flip. 2 years ago, I couldn't get him to take a stand on removing the Confederate monument from Forest Hill Cemetery. And I've been listening to what he's been saying over the past hour of this debate, what he's been saying about me, and it comes off as a bit ironic. While David talks about affordable housing, I've been getting it done. David talks about sustainability, but like I said, I've never seen him at a single meeting of the Sustainable Madison Committee, nor is he at meetings I hold on a regular basis with stakeholders like 350 Madison. As I mentioned earlier, David asked to be appointed to one of our transportation committees, and I recommended him to the mayor. Unfortunately, he wasn't appointed, but I haven't seen him at any of those meetings, nor has he met with Alder Foster, who is our resident transportation expert on council. David has lots of great ideas, and I appreciate that. Some of them I question their feasibility, but I appreciate his enthusiasm. And I have never turned down a request to discuss policy with David or anyone else. He just hasn't asked. Just like 2 years ago, David is going up to homes with my yard signs and trying to talk folks out of supporting me. Last time he said I was too extreme, too much of an activist, that I wouldn't be able to get anything done. Now he says I'm not extreme enough. I've learned during my first term on council the importance of making sure all views are considered. I have strong relationships with leaders in each of our neighborhoods and maintain a strong presence in the community to remain accountable and connected to my constituents. Racial equity, climate justice, housing affordability, representing the interests of the residents of District 13, particularly elevating and listening and responding to the concerns of District 13's most vulnerable residents. That's what I'm about. I haven't changed. I'm running for re-election to continue the work I've started, and I ask for your vote on April 6th. Go to tagevers.com to find out more.
Thank you both for your closing remarks. I want to thank our listeners and our viewers for joining us for this afternoon. It's sunny outside. I know it's cold, but it is a beautiful day. I also want to thank Alec, who has been live tweeting. That's at Highest Wins on Twitter. Thank you, Alec. I want to thank Abby for joining us today. I'm your host, Jade Siri Ramos. I'm the producer for all debates this election season. Don't forget to vote in the spring primary. That's Tuesday, February 16th, and absentee voting for that election has already begun. You can go to myvote.wi.gov to check your registration status, request an absentee ballot, and you can do in-person absentee voting now as well.
And Tuesday, April 6th, that's the date you'll want to write down and remember for the spring general election. And that is, of course, when these candidates, Tag Evers and David Hoffert, will face off for the election to District 13 seat on the Madison City Council. Again, I'm Abby Becker, and it was awesome to be here today with WORT. Thanks again for the invite, and have a great Saturday, everyone.
Bye.